Presented by Caltech.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Watson Lecture. Before getting on with the program, let me announce the next lecture, which will actually be April 1st, 2015. This is not a joke. The talk will be given by Pamela Borkman, Max Delbruck Professor of Biology, and the talk will be about a molecular arms race, the immune system versus HIV. So, good evening. I'm Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, the chair of the Division of the Humanities and the Social Sciences at Caltech. It is a real pleasure for me to introduce tonight's Watson Lecture speaker, my colleague John O'Doherty. John is professor of psychology and director of Caltech's Brain Imaging Center. He is also Irish, and his path from Dublin to Pasadena has been an interesting one. John received a bachelor's degree in psychology and mathematics from Trinity College in 1996. He then studied at Oxford University, where he received a PhD in experimental psychology in 2001. From there, he went to London for a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of Neurology at University College London until 2004, when he joined the Caltech faculty. A couple years later, John felt the pull of the Irish tiger and returned to Trinity College Dublin, to Caltech's great chagrin. But thanks to our weather and the financial crisis, John returned to Caltech in 2010 as a full professor. Everyone was happy again in Pasadena, and the brain imaging data tells us that was true. So much for titles and degrees. Now for a little substance. John is part of a small group of scholars at Caltech seeking to understand the neural basis of decision-making. It is a particularly distinguished, and as befits Caltech, unusual group of economists and psychologists in close interactions with biologists. Such a collaboration you would find nowhere else, and it is making major contributions to our understanding of how people make decisions, how we learn, if you'd like, or how we do not learn from our mistakes. In his research, John has been a pioneer of what is known as computational neuroscience, where scholars derive detailed mathematical models of what they think the brain is doing, and then test these models against a variety of behavioral and neuroimaging data. Thus, John, like many of us at Caltech, ranges across many fields, from mathematics to computer science, from imaging to psychology. And I'm sure his talk tonight, How the Brain Learns from the Past and Makes Good Decisions for the Future, a tour of neural reinforcement learning, will take us through these fields and a bit more. Like all great Watson lectures, John is going to stretch our minds. Enjoy. John, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jean-Laurent, for the very kind introduction. That's a lot, certainly, to live up to. And thank you all very much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be able to give this lecture, and a real privilege. So, as Jean-Laurent already alluded to, one of the problems that my lab and me as an individual is most interested in understanding is, how is it that the brain can make decisions? Okay, so imagine you're walking in the forest and you come to this bifurcated path, and you can either choose to go this way or choose to go that way. How do you resolve this? How do you work out which way to go? Can we start to understand what's going on in your brain when you're solving this kind of problem? And one kind of feature about this that's interesting is that there's really no information available to you that could tell you, unless you're a MacGyver, which way you should be going, right? Instead, you have to rely maybe on past experience. So you have to rely on, maybe, if you went this way last week and you got mauled by a bear, well, maybe you should go this way, okay? So this is sort of an interesting problem. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? So there's certainly no certainty if you go this way that the bear won't have decided to troop through the woods and actually meet you on this path, right? So I think there's a lot of stuff going on, and can we start to unpack how the brain actually solves this? And if you actually think about it, what's going on in our brains, or to us as individuals, is that we're processing what's going on in the world. Okay, so there's stimuli going on in the world, And eventually, we have to select actions. We have to act on the world in certain ways. And obviously, what we want to do is we want to select those actions that produce the most benefit to us and minimize the harm that we might incur. And so what's going on is that in the middle is this brain that's basically transforming the information that we get about the world and enabling that to be converted into actions that we can then act on the world. So we can think of our brain as essentially as a device that has evolved to help us make good decisions that maximize our well-being. Now, neuroscientists have been looking at the brain for quite some time, and we've actually already unpacked what certain parts of the brain are doing. So we know that there are parts of the brain that are doing things called sensory decoding or perception. Basically, parts of the brain that are recognizing things in the world about us and working out what they are, whether they're an object, such as this bottle of water, or something moving, or a person. We can recognize that, for example, by decoding our visual scene. And we know there's parts of the brain that are specialized for doing this. And we don't understand it all yet, but at least we have a good idea approximately what we think that bit of the brain might be doing. And we also have parts of our brain, such as the motor cortex up here, that we know are involved in action selection, selecting actions, making movements. And we have, although again, we don't fully understand how it works, we have a pretty good idea what it's doing. But what's going on in the middle? Well, what's going on in the middle is how you transform the information that you decode into the action. And that's really what the decision is all about. And so decision neuroscience, which is this area that myself and my colleagues that Jean-Laurent alluded to at Caltech, that's what we're studying. We're trying to understand what's going on in this middle bit, which I think is one of the biggest mysteries to solve about the brain. So let's try to get some insight into how the brain might actually be making decisions. And to get the first hint, we can actually go back to the mid-19th century, to perhaps the first report of a relationship between something going on in the brain and decision making. And this is now a very famous case that you'll find in psychology and neurology textbooks, and many of you may have heard about this guy. This guy's called Phineas Gage, and he was a railroad construction worker. And his day job was to blast rock. So he drilled a hole and then filled it with blasting powder, basically gunpowder. And he covered it with sand and then compacted it using a tamping iron, okay, which you can see here. And on a particular occasion outside Cavendish, Vermont, around 4:30 p.m., unfortunately, instead of basically the tamping iron coming away in his hand and then subsequently exploding the rock, it actually blasted while he was standing over it through his skull. And it basically entered through one of his eyeballs and came out the top of his head. And Harlow was a physician at the time who was essentially treating Gage, and he survived. And what Harlow noticed was that the people that Gage worked with and his family members, the people who knew him, observed that there were a lot of changes in his behavior. So whereas before, apparently, he'd been quite a good, a shrewd, smart person, very social, very good socially, very energetic, very good at making plans and so on. So basically a good, upstanding citizen. After his lesion, his personality had changed quite a lot. And he became, I think, very unreliable. He would become very impatient. He was socially inappropriate. But also, I think what's most interesting is, for the purpose of this talk, he was devising many plans of future operations, which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned in turn for others appearing more feasible. So he appears to be manifesting deficits in decision-making. Okay? And Hannah Damasio came along basically about 150 years later, and she was a neurologist. She's actually now at USC. And what she did is she, using computer reconstruction techniques, she reconstructed the trajectory of the tamping iron through Phineas Gage's brain. And what she worked out is that the tamping iron went through a part of the brain that is called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So here's a picture of the front of the brain. And the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is this area here, which is a medial part of the brain, the midline. You can also see it if you look at this model. It's basically just this part here, as well as this area down here called the orbitofrontal cortex. So called because it's above the orbits of the eyes. So if we turn the brain, this brain might fall apart if I do it. It's basically under here. Okay, so it's this bit here that you can see. Okay, so these are the areas that obtained the principal damage in Phineas Gage. And so these people hypothesized, well, this area might be important for decision making. And a colleague of hers, a guy called Anton Bashara, who's actually also now down the road at USC, wanted to test this more formally in the laboratory. So he brought in people who had sustained damage to their ventromedial prefrontal cortices, mostly due to tumors as opposed to tamping irons. But nevertheless, unfortunately, in these people, the brain tissue is very damaged. And what he did is he had them do this very, very simple decision-making task. So it's basically like a card task. And an individual selects a card from one of these 4 decks and gets feedback, which is to either win or lose money. And then you keep doing that. And basically, 2 of these card decks are what were called advantageous, which is that if you selected from them and you kept doing so, cumulatively over time, you'd start to win money, more money than you lost. So they're the good decks that you should be choosing from. Whereas the other 2 decks would actually start to penalize you more than you won, and you'd end up in the red after 100 trials. Okay, so basically what he did is to try to look to see how people with damage to this part of the brain did on this task compared to people that didn't have damage to this part of the brain. And what he found is whereas it might be very hard to see this, we just have to take my word for it, whereas the healthy people with intact brains gradually learned to select from the decks that were advantageous over time, the people with the damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex actually failed to do so. So they seem to be exhibiting a deficit in making decisions. Okay? Now, a big question is, well, can we start to understand what it is that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain are doing to help the brain make good decisions if you happen to have that bit of the brain intact? And one sort of idea about how we might make decisions is that we might have a representation of how good or bad we think an action that we might take will be for us. Okay? So how valuable, how good will it make us feel if we take an action? Okay, so imagine, just to illustrate this, imagine we're making choices between these very simple items, such as this apple, and this orange, and this hamburger. So imagine when we're making a decision, we have some representation, internal representation, which tells us how good we think these items are, how much we like these items. And so maybe this could be my value or utility that I'll have for the hamburger relative to these other 2. And then if I have a higher value or utility for the hamburger, then I'll probably select this more often than not. Okay? So this is kind of a very useful idea. Economists have had this idea for a very long time. And then we can maybe see whether this idea applies to trying to understand how the brain might make decisions. And so a central idea that economists have had is that an agent, a rational agent in particular, will ultimately take choices that will maximize his or her expected value or utility. So basically you want to maximize the things that are good and minimize the things that are bad for you. Okay? And so let's imagine this other kind of decision problem. It's a so-called n-armed bandit problem, or here there are 3 bandits. And to imagine this, you can think about going to Vegas for the weekend, and you walk into a casino, and there's 3 slot machines in front of you, and you know that one of them might be paying out more money than the others, but of course you've no information about which machine might be better. Okay, so the question is, how would you solve that kind of problem? And one idea is that you might sample the machines, see what you win or lose, and over time build up an expectation about how much money on average you think you'll win on the different machines. So you have this internalized representation of how much you expect to get. And then you can, at the point of decision making, choose the action that gives you the most reward, okay? Gives the most future reward, okay? So you're coming along, you're going to experience the rewards, and gradually you'll use that information over trial and error learning to inform your expectations, okay? And we can talk about there being different components that you need to represent in your brain that allow you to solve this problem. So we can talk about experience values. So when you come along and you choose a slot machine and you win or lose money on that machine, you have to be able to, your brain has to be able to tell whether winning $1 feels good or is better for you than winning nothing or losing $1. So there's some bit of your brain has to process the value of things that you're experiencing as they happen, okay? And what we call experience value. Another way to think about this is the pleasure or pain that happens when an outcome is actually experienced. And we can also talk about decision values, which is basically at the time of decision making, this is the information you need to work out whether a particular action or a particular slot machine is better than the other, okay? You want to be able to compare the decision values for each of these different slot machines. So let's first look at how experience values are encoded in the brain. Well, how can we study this in the brain? Well, it's kind of tricky. But one thing we could do is give stuff to an individual that they report differs in experienced value or pleasantness. And then we can look for areas of the brain where neural activity changes as a function of those changes in subjective experienced value. Okay, next problem. How can we actually measure activity in the brain? So in the experiments I'm going to talk to you about, we're studying human brains. And what we know about how brains work is that brains work through the activity of neurons, the electrical activity of these nerve cells in our brain. And when those nerve cells fire or change their activity, those changes in activity produce our thoughts, our experiences, our feelings. So if we want to understand how the brain is working, we need to be able to measure the change in neural activity as it's happening as people are doing different tasks. Now, one way you can do that is to stick electrodes into people's heads and measure the electrical activity directly inside the brain of the neurons. Now, the trouble with that is that it's not very ethical for us to open people's brains and stick electrodes in. Now, another way you can do that is to take advantage of some tricks. So when the brain is active, when parts of your brain are more active and they're basically doing stuff, what happens is that that part of the brain needs glucose and oxygen so that it can get the energy it needs to produce the neural activity. And so what happens is that there's an increase in blood flow to that region and an increase in the flow of oxygen to that area. And what we can do is we can put people in these MRI machines. And an MRI machine is like the thing when you go, if you break your ankle and you go and get a scan at the hospital, typically you'll go into an MRI machine. And one interesting thing is that what this is doing, so it's a very powerful magnet, and what you can detect in this machine are changes in magnetic properties, local magnetic properties in certain parts of the brain. And what's really cool is that when, as I already mentioned, when a part of your brain is more active, you get greater amount of oxygenated blood, or oxyhemoglobin, will come to that part of the brain, okay? And the difference between oxyhemoglobin and deoxyhemoglobin results in differences in magnetic signal in local tissue. And we can detect those changes in the magnetic properties in this MRI machine. And so now we have a way not of just producing a picture of your ankle with a break in it, but also producing pictures of parts of the brain where activity is changing as people are doing different tasks. And so that's what we can do. So what can we do with this technique? Well, here's one example. So this is an experiment in which we had people that were hungry, and we brought them in to the scanner. We put them in, and we pumped in odors of two different foods, banana odor and vanilla odor. So they're sitting there smelling these nice odors. We measure the activity, we take them out, and we stuff them with bananas until they don't want any more. Okay, so what is happening when we stuff them with bananas? Well, what's happening actually is that there's a change in the pleasantness of the banana, because once you get satiated on the banana, you don't want any more, and the pleasantness of the odor of bananas will go down. But the pleasantness of the vanilla ice cream won't go down so much. You might still have space left to have a big tub of Haagen-Dazs, even if you've feasted on bananas. And so we can use that by putting people back in the scanner and presenting the same odors again, and looking for the changes in responses to the banana odor that don't happen to the vanilla odor. And that tells us something about where the pleasantness of the food odor is represented. And to make a long story short, when we do that, we find that activity in the orbitofrontal cortex, which is part of this ventromedial prefrontal cortex region, these are 5 different individuals, is showing activity that looks like it's tracking the pleasantness of the odors. So before they're satiated and they're smelling the banana, the response is quite high in this area. It goes down after they've been satiated on the banana, whereas to the vanilla odor, from pre to post satiation, if anything, the activity increases, and there's certainly no change. So suggesting that this region is representing the pleasantness of the odor. So here's another experiment we can do. This time people are playing this very simple task. They're making choices between these 2 options, and they get to win and lose money as a function of the choices they make. These are in pounds. This experiment was done in the UK. And what we do is basically as they make different choices, they win different amounts of money. And we can then just look to see if there is anywhere in the brain that's changing its activity as they win different amounts. And we find this region, again, of medial orbitofrontal cortex, which is part of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that is correlating with the amount of money that they win, okay, the value of the money that they obtain. So again, suggesting that this same area is representing the experienced value of money. So not only food odors, but also money. Here's another example. So this is an experiment in which we presented people with faces. So we didn't actually tell them what the experiment was about. We just said, we're going to present you with faces, male and female faces, and I just want you to tell us, is it a male or a female face? But what we did is we varied the attractiveness, the facial attractiveness of the face. I'm only showing you a sample of faces that rated high in attractiveness. I'm not going to show you the less attractive faces, but you get the idea. And as they're doing the task, we can then look for changes in their brain activity. And we found that there are regions, again, this ventromedial prefrontal cortex, including this medial orbital region and extending up, is active when they are seeing faces that are more attractive compared to when they see less attractive faces. Okay? So again, we're getting this idea that for many different types of things, this region seems to represent the experienced value. Here's another example. Many of you may like wine, and many of you may consider yourselves to be aficionados, good at telling a good bottle of wine from a bad bottle of wine. Okay? You may have a good palate. So what if I told you, I show you these two glasses of wine, and I let you sample them, and I tell you, well, this one came from a bottle that cost $10, and this one came from a bottle that cost $90. Do you think you'd be influenced by me telling you that? If you consider yourself to be a wine aficionado, you'll say, definitely not, no. Well, here's an experiment we did, and actually this wasn't done in wine experts, it was just done in Caltech students. So maybe that tells you all you need to know. And so what we did is we basically did, this was an experiment I did in collaboration with Antonio Rangel, who's also a neuroeconomist here at Caltech. And what we did is we basically had 2 bottles of wine. One was basically cost $5, and the other one cost $90. And we pumped this into people while they're in the scanner, so they're getting squirts of this wine, and then they get to rinse. They don't get to spit in the scanner because it would be too messy, but they do have to swallow. And we tell them on different trials that the wine costs different amounts. So for the $5 wine, we said it either costs $5 or it costs $45. And for the $90 wine, we said it either cost $90 or $10. And what we found is that we took ratings of how much they liked the wine as they were sampling it. And we found that depending on the price that we gave, people had very different reactions in terms of how much they liked the wine. So basically, they were very sensitive to this price label. They much preferred the $5 wine if we said it cost $45. And they much preferred the $90 wine if we said it cost $90 compared to $10. So what it's telling you is that people's pleasantness or subjective reaction to the wine, subjective value for the wine, isn't necessarily a function purely of its physical properties, such as its taste or flavor, or even of its price. It's a function of its objective price. It's a function of basically people's expectations for what they think the wine should be, as well as on top of its objective properties. So it's basically our pleasure, our subjective reaction to things is very influenced by contextual information and expectations. And that's true in the brain too. So the response in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex was elevated when you thought the wine was more expensive, irrespective of what objectively the wine was, and it was decreased when you thought the wine was less expensive. Okay, suggesting that, again, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is representing this experienced value. Okay, so now we've got this idea that there is this bit of the brain that represents experienced value. So let's turn to decision values. Where in the brain are decision values represented? So before we get to that, we have this problem of, well, how do you learn your decision values in the first place? Because of course when you first choose these slot machines, unless you prefer the color green or something, there's no reason to develop decision values. So you have to learn them through trial and error. And so one idea that people have had is that the one way that you might do this is by making use of a signal called a prediction error. And a prediction error is really just the degree of surprise you experience. How surprised are you at an outcome? Another way to think about it is the difference between what your experienced value actually is and what you expect it will be, i.e. your decision value. Okay? So let's think about that in a more concrete way. Let's say we're choosing a slot machine and we have a very low expectation. This is our expectation here, our value here on this axis. We've got a very low value for this machine. We come along, we choose it, and we win $1. And so our prediction error, which is how surprised we are, is quite positive because we actually are surprised. We weren't expecting to win $1. Hey, big prediction error, okay? So you then use that to update your expectation. So now I'm expecting to get a bit more reward, to have a bit higher value for this machine. And I come along again, and I choose again, and whoa, I also got $1. And now I'm a bit less surprised because it's no longer, because I won before, okay? But I'm still a little bit surprised. And then the idea is I keep updating my expectations until eventually I'm not surprised anymore. And the idea is I've learned about the value of the machine. Because there's no longer any discrepancy between what I expect I'm going to get and what I actually get. But sometimes life is not fair, and I've got a high value for this machine. I come along, I expect to win. Oh, I lost. Okay? That's probably most people's experience in Vegas. And then I've got this big negative prediction error. So it's a negative surprise now, and I actually use that to decrease my expectations. So it's a very flexible way of learning about the value of things. And the reason why people got interested in this is from the work of a guy called Wolfram Schultz, who actually also visits, he's at Cambridge in the UK, but he visits us here in Caltech every 3 months for the weather, as well as to talk to us. Well, I'd like to think so. And what he's doing is he's recording from neurons called dopamine neurons, deep in the midbrain, which is down here. So these little nuclei down here that contain these neurons that contain the neurotransmitter dopamine, and they send signals up to all these other parts of the brain. And what he found is that these neurons, he recorded this in the monkey brain, these neurons look like a prediction error. They're basically representing how surprised the monkey is when it gets a reward that it wasn't expecting. And so we became interested in this, and we wanted to see, well, do we see similar types of signals in the human brain that might be underpinning learning. So we had people perform tasks. Here's just an example of one of the tasks that we might give people. It's a bandit task. We've already seen what it's like. You've got multiple slot machines. You choose one, slot machine spins, and then you get outcomes. And the different machines, different color machines you see here, the amount of money you get or amount of points you win on these machines varies over time. And so it's not the case that one machine is always better, so you have to keep sampling from the different machines, okay? And what we can do is we can use some mathematical modeling to keep track of what we think the prediction errors should be at each point in time as you're doing the task, as well as what your expected value should be, your expected decision values for the different slot machines should be. And so we can look in different parts of the brain for these signals. So we can look down here in the midbrain and see, do we see these signals? And lo and behold, we do. So we can, this is using a thing called high resolution fMRI, where we're really zooming in, trying to maximize the resolution, because these are very, very small areas, I mean, several millimeters, but we're looking down and we can see activity down here that is correlating with these prediction error signals, just like was found in the other animals. And we can also look in areas that are targets of these dopamine neurons, that are getting dopamine released. And we can see, do we see prediction error signals there? And so one area in particular is a region called the striatum, which is in the center of your brain, the middle part of your brain. And this area receives the densest input from these dopamine neurons. And indeed, we can see prediction errors being represented in this part of the brain too. Okay? So we have this evidence that there are these signals that seem to be reported or present in the brain whilst you're learning to build expectations that you can then use to inform your decision making. What about the decision values themselves? Where are they represented? Well, it's not going to be too much of a surprise. We see them also in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So at the time you're making a choice, activity there signals how good or bad you think that choice is going to be in terms of your expected future reward. And so the idea is that the activity here could be used to inform your decision making. And so now you can see, well, it's maybe not surprising that if you had damage to this part of the brain, you might not be very good at making decisions. Okay, so another kind of really interesting problem is, well, very often, so the task you've seen up to now, you're making similar decisions. You're making decisions about winning money or points and so on. But often we have to make very different kinds of decisions about things between very different types of goods. So here's an example. Imagine I have to make a decision between buying a smartphone, buying a ticket to see my favorite band in a concert, or a very fine bottle of Irish whiskey. Okay. I think you know where I'm going with this. If you imagine what my own subjective values would be, well, I'm going to have a very high value for this whiskey. Now, the idea is that in order to make these kinds of decisions, what you need to do is you need to represent them in a common scale. So you have to have a common currency. You have to be able to compare how much value is a smartphone to me compared to a bottle of whiskey. Because otherwise I can't make the decision because they won't be comparable. And so one question could be, is there any evidence for a part of the brain that represents this integrated type of value? And so very crudely, what we might imagine is that there might be, of course, parts of the brain that decode the information, that recognize whether it's a bottle of whiskey or whether it's a smartphone. And then you have parts that might represent the value of each of these things. And then somewhere, this might be all put into a common scale, and there might be a region that enables you to compare the values and make a decision. So can we find any evidence for this kind of common valuation area? So this is an experiment, also in collaboration with Antonio Rangal, that we did. And what we did is we had put people in the scanner, and they were presented with different kinds of items. So some items were food items, so such as these potato chips, or these cookies, or they might have seen a T-shirt or this Star Wars DVD, or they might even see items such as the opportunity to play a monetary gamble, so a certain prospect of winning, say, $5. And what we did is we basically got a measure of how much people valued these items by saying how much we give you an endowment, we give you a small amount of money, we'll say how much you're going to pay, are you willing to pay for the opportunity to obtain that item. And then we basically, at the end, you get to obtain some of the items depending on how much you said you were willing to pay for it. Okay. And we can then look to see, now we've got this measure of how much they value each of the items, we can see, well, where in the brain is correlating with the value at the time of decision making. And once again, no surprise, we see the ventromedial prefrontal cortex coming up. And so it's there for money in green, it's there for consumer goods, and it's there for these snack foods. And you can see there's kind of a lot of similarity in the areas that are activated, but we can then say, well, what's commonly active across all three categories? And we see this very kind of neat area of ventromedial prefrontal cortex that represents the value of all these different items. And so the idea is that you could then use this could be where you have this common currency that you can then use to motivate decisions between different kinds of goods. Okay, so, well, at the start of my talk, I was mentioning that many times we're making decisions under situations of considerable uncertainty. So given that uncertainty is intrinsic to the world that we live in, it might make sense that the brain also somehow tries to do something with uncertainty. It tries to represent and understand uncertainty. And actually, there are kind of many different kinds of uncertainty. So one kind of uncertainty is what's called expected uncertainty. So imagine we have, going back to our slot machines again, we've got two slot machines, and you know the green slot machine pays $10 with a 50% chance, or else $0. Okay, so half the time it pays 10, half the time it pays 0. And the red slot machine pays $5 all the time. So basically this is something intrinsic to the slot machines. It's not something I'm doing, it's something the slot machines are doing. But these slot machines are varying in their uncertainty, right? So I'm much more certain in the outcome on this machine than I am on this one. And so this type of uncertainty is also can be described in the words of a former Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, the known unknowns. And economists would call this risk, okay? Now, unexpected uncertainty is supposing you're just coming along and everything's going hunky-dory, you're playing the red slot machine, and suddenly it pays out $20. Or suddenly you get stung for $50. Well, that's unexpected, okay? You weren't expecting that to happen, and that's essentially a type of uncertainty. And again, in the Rumsfeldian world, these are the unknown unknowns, okay? And we can also talk about yet another kind of uncertainty. So imagine that I ask you to estimate the average height of everyone in this lecture theatre. How would you do that? Well, obviously, there are a lot of people here. Might take you a long time to get out your ruler and measure everyone. So what you might decide is, I'm going to take 5 people at random and measure them, okay? And measure their height, and that'll be my answer. Well, you know, problem is you might have picked 5 unusually tall people or 5 unusually short people, so you don't really know how representative that is, right? Well, maybe just to make it a little bit more representative, I'll pick 10 people at random, okay? Now I'm getting a slightly more precise estimate, but it still could be very noisy, because I still could have picked 10 very small people or 10 very tall people. Well, if I did 100 people at random, that's probably going to be more accurate again, okay? So what estimation uncertainty is a measure of how accurate your estimate is. Because your measure the accuracy will depend on how many samples you've had of a particular outcome, okay? So there's this other type of uncertainty called estimation uncertainty. And these different kinds of uncertainty can be used in different ways to inform your decision making. So, for example, unexpected uncertainty, or risk, you might choose to seek out risk. You might be a risk taker. Some people are. Or you might hate risk. You might want to avoid it. Okay, so that could feed into your preference in terms of what you want to do. Estimation uncertainty, well, if you actually want to really know about your world and maximize your opportunities, you should actually seek out things about which you have estimation uncertainty, because you want to learn about something and minimize your estimation uncertainty. So you might choose the unknown and try to learn more about it. Alternatively, you might not want, might not like the unknown, so you might choose to avoid it. So again, you can see how that could influence your decision-making strategies. An unexpected uncertainty, if something happens you didn't expect to happen, well, you should probably improve how you're learning, because maybe you've made a mistake, or maybe you need to attend or focus more closely on what's going on. So you might want to change your attention, okay? And we can look, in collaboration with Elise Paisan and Simon Dunn and Peter Boserts, we looked in the brain to see, are there any representations of these different kinds of uncertainty? And I'm not going to go through the details of the brain areas, but basically there's lots of bits of the brain that seem to have this representation of unexpected uncertainty in the cortex as well as below the cortex. And we can even go look down in the midbrain, like we did before for dopamine, in an area that contains a different kind of neurotransmitter. This is an area called the locus ceruleus, and it contains noradrenergic neurons. So it's a different type of brain chemical. And these neurons project also very widely throughout the brain. And so one idea is that when you're in a very unexpected uncertainty situation, these neurons release a lot of neurotransmitter into other parts of the brain, which increase how much you attend and how much you focus. Okay? And we also see estimation uncertainty, again, in different parts of the cortex. Okay? So, and as well, expected uncertainty. So we can see there's also regions of the brain that are tracking this unexpected uncertainty or risk. So all of these signals at the time of decision making are being represented in your brain, and your brain can basically use them in different ways to guide your choices. Okay. So another question that you might have is, well, is it the case that people are always behaving in ways that maximize expected utility? Is that what people are always doing? Are they always thinking about the value or utility of a particular goal and selecting actions that go there? Are they always planning? Are they always behaving in a very sort of rational way? And the answer is no. Sometimes we are creatures of habit. And here's an example. So imagine this is a road in Ireland, in the countryside. Imagine you've gone on vacation to Ireland. Now, one of the things about Ireland is that you actually drive on the left. The rule is you drive on the left, not on the right. Okay? And imagine you come to the airport, you rent your car, you're out driving, you're going left, 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 left. You're very careful, goal-directed on all the rest. Go into a nice restaurant, sit down, have a nice meal. I won't mention anything about Guinness. You come back out again, you're all relaxed, lovely vacation, and suddenly you drive on the right. And the outcome could, as you can see on this kind of road, might not work out so well. And people actually estimate that about 10% of all road accidents in Ireland apparently involve a foreign tourist in some way. So it's clearly an issue. And so actually, if you do rent a car in Ireland, you'll have all these signs everywhere, even on the windscreen, saying, drive on the left, just to try and remind you to do that. So what's going on there is that the habit is intruding. You have this habit of driving on the right. And so the absence of any other clues, which this road is not really marked in any way, or there's no other cars that you can see, this habit might get triggered instead of the goal-directed action, which would be to drive on the left. So how can we test for habits? Well, imagine that I have a refrigerator in my house, which indeed I do. And every day I come along and I open my fridge door and I obtain a cupcake, and I get to learn about that. So when I open the action of opening the fridge door retrieves the cupcake. Do that a lot. One day I go to a cafe and I go crazy. So I consume a whole load of cupcakes. Okay? Now, the last thing I want is a cupcake anymore. I'm absolutely stuffed, just like my research participants were on those bananas. I'm stuffed on these cupcakes, and I don't want any more. So what happens if I go back to my refrigerator? Do I open the door, and retrieve a cupcake, or do I not? And the thing is, if I don't do it, then I'm actually thinking in a goal-directed way, because I'm thinking about the value of the cupcakes, which I no longer want, and I'm not choosing the action. But if I'm acting in a habitual way, I'll just do it anyway, because I'm doing it without thinking, okay? So that's actually a way of testing for habits. And this is work that Bernard Balleine, who used to be at UCLA, but now is in Sydney, and Tony Dickinson did a few years ago. And basically, they did this in rats. So they trained rats to press levers to get foods. So this lever retrieves this type of food, and this other type of lever retrieves this other kind of food. And they exposed them to moderate training. So basically, they learned about what happens if you press this action, if you press this lever, what you're going to get, and if you press this lever, what are you going to get, okay? And they're hungry, so they're motivated to do it. So this one group got moderate training, but enough so they knew what was going on. This other group got extensive training, so they really heavily trained on these two actions and outcomes. And what they did is they then fed the rats until they're stuffed on one of these foods, okay? So then devalued one of the outcomes. And then the question is, what happens? And what they found is that after moderate training, the rats basically stopped responding or decreased their responding on the action that's now associated with the now devalued food, because they don't want it anymore, so they respond less. But after extensive training, they no longer do that. They basically respond just as often on the devalued action as they do on the still valued action. So now they're like indifferent, so they're acting in a habitual way. And so one question is, can we find evidence that humans can do the same thing? Because it might well be that, well, rats are kind of, we're not as clever as humans, so maybe humans would never do something like that. And so what we did is we basically replicated the same experiment in people. So they're choosing these actions, and in one context, basically they're in the scanner, they can press buttons. And here, it's like on a keyboard, they can press this button. If they press this button, they obtain a picture of an M&M. And in this condition, if they press this button, they receive a Frito, and this is just a control where they don't do anything. And what we can do is, after they come out of the scanner, we feed them on one of these two foods. So they're very hungry, motivated, so actually they get whatever food they selected. So they see an M&M, they get an M&M. They see, if they chose a Frito, they get a Frito. And so we feed them, but not too much, so that they're still hungry. And we kind of repeat that a bunch of times. And what we then do is one of the foods, they're fed until they're stuffed. So again, we're giving them all these M&Ms they can eat until they're satiated, or another group will give them Fritos until they're satiated, okay? So we're now devaluing one of the actions, but leaving the other one still valued. And what we find is if they get 1 day of training, which is this red line here, they basically decrease their responding on the action that has been devalued, just like the rats do. So they're showing that they're still goal-directed. They no longer want the food that's been devalued, so they're not responding for it. Whereas after 3 days of training, it's only a small amount, not being trained for a whole 3 days, they're just getting a half an hour a day. They're basically now showing this indifference. They're basically acting as if they're habitized. They're responding as much for the action associated with the now devalued outcome as they are for the action associated with the still valued outcome. So suggesting that they're habitized. And we can look in the brain and see, well, where in the brain do we see these kinds of habits developing? And there's one area in the brain that was basically increasing its activity over time, over the days, as the people developed habits, as they became habitized. And that region is an area called the posterior putamen. And that's a similar area that was identified in studies in the rat. Okay, so it suggests we're onto something, that there is this part of the brain that is representing or involved when you're behaving in a habitual way. Okay, so now we have this idea, well, sometimes you can be habitual, sometimes you can be goal-directed. And which system, how do you decide which system to use? That's a big question. And here's one, I think it's not the only way, but it's one idea. So I'm going to illustrate this with respect to soccer, the game of soccer. And so occasionally in soccer, for an infraction by one team, a penalty kick is awarded, in which one of the teams has a goalkeeper who stays in the goal, and another, a member of the opposing team, tries to kick a ball past him. Okay? Now, imagine that you are the captain of the opposing team, and you have a choice of who you're going to select to take the penalty kick. So player A has his stats. He missed 9 out of the last 10 penalties he took. Okay? Doesn't sound so good. Player B missed 1 out of the last 10 penalties. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean player A might be good. He might just have been having a bad season, and maybe next season he'll be better. But clearly, you should probably pick player B, right, this time. Not hope that he's going to come good on this one occasion. And so the idea is that what you're doing is you're taking into account the reliability of the players when you're making your choice. And the idea is that maybe the brain decides which one of these systems to choose based on how reliable the system is. And what it might do is that early on, the goal-directed system might be more reliable because you have a much richer representation. But over time, your habit system might start to get more and more reliable as it builds up experience. It's just slower, but it will eventually get to the right answer. And all else being equal, you should be habitual because it's much less expensive to be so. It's very cheap. It doesn't involve as much mental effort to be habitual as it does to be goal-directed. So maybe this could be one way that the brain might decide by taking into account the relative reliability. And with Sangwan Lee in my lab and Shinshin Mojo, who's another Caltech professor, we look to see where in the brain is there a part of the brain that is tracking the reliability of the predictions of the two systems, which could then be used to kind of arbitrate between them and decide which one should control behavior. And indeed, we find a region of lateral, so it's not part of the VMPFC we've talked about before, ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's an area called the inferior lateral prefrontal cortex, and another region called the frontopolar cortex. And these areas appear to have this reliability signal, and we've also found that it might work by inhibiting your habitual system when it thinks you should be goal-directed. Okay? So I'm going to kind of finish up. So we have, I've talked about this problem of how does the brain make decisions under uncertainty. And I've showed you that we're starting to get some insight into the kind of information the brain might be using and the kind of mechanisms the brain might be using to solve this problem. We saw that there are these things called decision values, which can be used to guide future choice, and they're present in a place called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, alongside these experience values, which you need to have to learn decision values in the first place. And we saw that at least one way decision values might be learned is via this prediction error mechanism, which could depend in part on dopamine neurons. And we also found that different kinds of uncertainty are represented in the brain, different forms, expected, unexpected, and estimation uncertainty. And finally, we found that we can distinguish between two very different systems for governing behavior, the more goal-directed system, which is kind of everything we were talking about up to now, and a habitual system, which may be much more reflexive in the kind of decisions it's making. So we're starting to gain an understanding into the kind of mechanisms the brain might be using. And where is this going in the future? This is a diagram that was made by David Van Essen and colleagues. David Van Essen was formerly actually at Caltech, and more recently he's been at Washington University in St. Louis. But he produced this diagram, and this is a diagram of the visual system. So it's not actually even considering some of the areas we've been talking about today. But what it's showing you, each of these different colors and labels represents a different brain area, okay? And all these lines represent connections between different brain areas. And I'm going to turn this off and ask you to reproduce the diagram. It should be pretty easy. But the basic take-home message is how mind-bogglingly complex this is. And we're not even talking about the whole brain. We're only talking about the visual system here. And so it might seem like an insurmountable problem to understand this kind of complexity and how all these areas are talking to each other and what they're doing at different times. But the message I'd say is that actually, if we go about things the right way, we can start to unravel these kinds of mysteries. And I think the approach that we have to studying decision making is a very useful strategy that might give us some traction in solving these kinds of problems. And the important thing is that we're looking at behavior, because the brain is a device that is designed by evolution. I shouldn't say design, I should say emerged through evolution to effectively solve problems. And one of those big problems is, how do you make good decisions to maximize your benefits, to stay alive and to procreate and do all those things that you need to pass on your genes. And if we can understand the kinds of behavioral problems the brain's trying to solve, and we can map that to computational models that describe how we think the brain could solve it, I think then we've got a way of trying to unpack what different parts of the brain are doing. I think that's a strategy that will allow us to gain fundamental insights. I'm not going to go into the detail here, but this is just one example of trying to unpack what the circuits might be doing using some of the experiments I talked about today. And so it still looks very crude, admittedly, doesn't have those hundreds of different connections, but I think eventually we can get there, unraveling that complexity, if we keep pursuing this kind of approach. So why is this important? Well, one reason why I think it's important is, well, first of all, understanding how we make decisions is fundamental for understanding who we are as people, as humans. How do humans work? It kind of gets at the core of what we are. But another thing I think that's really important, I think that gets me to work every day, is that certain neurological and psychiatric diseases involve dysfunction in these particular brain circuits and involve alterations in decision-making behavior. So, for example, one example would be depression. So depression, we can think of as resulting in impairments in making good decisions. So you tend to treat the world as a very negative place, as something where everything you do will have negative consequences. And so essentially you can think about that as you're making poor decisions. And it's associated with abnormalities in the area, one of the areas we've been talking about today, ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So I think it's no surprise that I think if we understand how the ventromedial prefrontal cortex works, we'll gain insight into how diseases like depression end up happening. And diseases of compulsion, so for example, obsessive compulsive disorder, if you are compulsively checking whether you left the gas on or not, or engaging in other kinds of compulsive behaviors, that might involve your habitual system. So habits, once they're in place, are very hard to overcome, and they tend to result in very persistent behaviors. And another example of that would be addiction. So drugs of abuse or any other type of addiction that you might develop might involve over-egging of your habit system. It might be controlling your behavior, and it might be very difficult to transition back to goal-directed behavior. And so if we understand the circuits involved in mediating goal-directed and habitual control, we might gain a key to understanding how these types of diseases emerge. And if we can know how it's happening in the healthy brain, that gives us insight into what's going on in the diseased brain. So a good example would be, if you're a car mechanic and you don't know how a car works, you're not going to be a very good mechanic. So if you want to be somebody that understands how these diseases happen, you need to understand how the brain actually malfunctions in order to enable these diseases to occur. And then we can maybe start to think about new treatments, better drugs, other types of techniques like stimulating brains, or even better behavioral interventions. And I'd like to conclude by thanking all of my collaborators, in particular people at Caltech who are in the behavioral and social neuroscience group or decision neuroscience group, Antonio Rangel, who's a very close collaborator. We work very closely together, and so similarly with Ralph Adolphs, Colin Kammerer, and Shin Shimojo, as well as many of my other collaborators, and of course, last but certainly not least, all the people in my lab who've made all these experiments possible and have done all the work, and I just get to come up here and blag about it. So thank you very much.